A concerto is a musical composition usually composed in 3 parts or movements, in which one solo instrument is accompanied by an orchestra or concert band. The etymology is uncertain, but the word seems to have originated from the conjunction of the 2 Latin words conserere and certamen. The idea is that the 2 parts in a concerto, the soloist and the orchestra or concert band, alternate episodes of opposition, cooperation, and independence in the creation of the music flow. The concerto, as understood in this modern way, arose in the Baroque period side by side with the concerto grosso, which contrasted a small group of instruments with the rest of the orchestra. The popularity of the concerto grosso form declined after the Baroque period, and the genre was not revived until the 20th century. The solo concerto, however, has remained a vital musical force from its inception to this day. Early Baroque concerto. The term concerto was initially used to denote works involving voices and instruments in which the instruments had independent parts as opposed to the Renaissance common practice in which the instruments that accompanied voices only doubled the voice parts. Examples of this earlier form of concerto include Giovanni Gabrieli's Enekel Sais, or Heinrich Schwann Quartet Z Saul, was the Volks du Mich. Late Baroque concerto. The concerto began to take its modern shape in the late Baroque period. Starting from a form called concerto grosso popularized by Arcangelo Corelli, it evolved into the form we understand today as performance of a soloist with against an orchestra. The main composers of concerti of the Baroque were Tommaso Albinoni, Antonio Vivaldi, Georg Philipp Telemann, Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, Pietro Locatelli, Giuseppe Tartini, Francesco Gimignani and Johann Joachim Quantz. The concerto was intended as a composition typical of the Italian style of the time, and all the composers were studying how to compose in the Italian fashion. The Baroque concerto was mainly for a string instrument or a wind instrument. During the Baroque period, before the invention of the piano, keyboard concertos were comparatively rare, with the exception of the organ and some harpsichord concertos by Johann Sebastian Bach. As the harpsichord evolved into the fortepiano, and in the end to the modern piano, the increased volume and the richer sound of the new instrument allowed the keyboard instrument to better compete with a full orchestra. Cello concertos have been written since the Baroque era if not earlier. Among the works from that period, those by Antonio Vivaldi and Giuseppe Tartini are still part of the standard repertoire today. Classical concerto. The concerti of the sons of Johann Sebastian Bach are perhaps the best links between those of the Baroque period and those of the classical era. It is conventional to state that the first movements of concerti from the classical period onwards follow the structure of sonata form. Final movements are often in rondo form, as in J.S. Bach's E major violin concerto. Violin concertos Mozart wrote 5 violin concertos, in quick succession. They show a number of influences, notably Italian and Austrian. Several passages have leanings towards folk music, as manifested in Austrian serenades. Haydn wrote 4 violin concerti. Beethoven wrote only 1 violin concerto. Cello concertos Haydn wrote at least 2 cello concertos which are the most important works in that genre of the classical era. However, CPE Bach unregistered trademark S3 cello concertos are also noteworthy. Keyboard concertos CPE Bach unregistered trademark S keyboard concertos contain some brilliant soloistic writing. Some of them have movements that run into one another without a break, and there are frequent cross-movement thematic references. Mozart, as a boy, made arrangements for harpsichord and orchestra of 3 sonata movements by Johann Christian Bach. By the time he was 20, Mozart was able to write concerta ritornelli that gave the orchestra admirable opportunity for asserting its character in an exposition with some 5 or 6 sharply contrasted themes, before the soloist enters to elaborate on the material. Some of his 27 piano are considered central in the instrument's repertoire. Haydn wrote a dozen keyboard concertos, although a couple of them are considered spurious. Concertos for other instruments CPE Bach wrote 4 flute concertos and 2 oboe concertos. Mozart wrote 1 concerto each for flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, 4 for horn, a concerto for flute, harp, and orchestra, a sinfonia concertante for violin, viola and orchestra, and exultate, jubilati, a de facto concerto for soprano voice. They all exploit and explore the characteristics of the solo instrument. Haydn wrote an important trumpet concerto and a sinfonia concertante for violin, cello, oboe and bassoon as well as 2 horn concertos. Romantic concerto equals violin concertos equals. In the 19th century the concerto as a vehicle for virtuosic display flourished as never before. It was the age in which the artist was seen as hero, to be worshipped and adulated with rapture. Early romantic traits can be found in the violin concertos of Viotti, but it is SPO Euro unregistered trademark S12 violin concertos, written between 1802 and 1827, that truly embrace the romantic spirit with their melodic as well as their dramatic qualities. Beethoven Euro unregistered trademark S violin concerto is unique in its scale and melodic qualities. Recitative elements are often incorporated, showing the influence of Italian opera on purely instrumental forms. Mendelssohn opens his violin concerto with the singing qualities of the violin solo. Even later passage work is dramatic and recitative-like, rather than merely virtuosic. The wind instruments state the lyrical second subject over a low pedal G on the violin certainly an innovation. The cadenza, placed at the end of the development and acting as a link to the recapitulation, is fully written out and integrated into the structure. The great violin virtuoso Nicola Paganini was a legendary figure who, as a composer, exploited the technical potential of his instrument to its very limits. Each one exploits rhapsodic ideas but is unique in its own form. The Belgian violinist Henri Temps, himself a major virtuoso, contributed several works to this form. A Permildo de Lalo's Symphony Espagnole displays virtuoso writing with a Spanish flavor. Max Bruch wrote 3 violin concertos, but it is the first, in G minor, that has remained a firm favorite in the repertoire. The opening movement relates so closely to the 2 remaining movements that it functions like an operatic prelude. Tchaikovsky Euro unregistered trademark S violin concerto is a powerful work which succeeds in being lyrical as well as superbly virtuosic. In the same year Brahms wrote his violin concerto for the virtuoso Joseph Joachim. This work makes new demands on the player, so much so that when it was first written it was referred to as a concerto against the violin. The first movement brings the concerto into the realm of symphonic development. The second movement is traditionally lyrical, and the finale is based on a lively Hungarian theme. Cello concertos equals. Since the Romantic era, the cello has received as much attention as the piano and violin as a concerto instrument, and many great Romantic and even more 20th-century composers left examples. Antorna Endvo unregistered trademark Euro unregistered trademark S cello concerto ranks among the supreme examples from the Romantic era while Robert Schumann's focuses on the lyrical qualities of the instrument. The instrument was also popular with composers of the Franco-Belgian tradition. Saint-Saëns and Temps wrote 2 cello concertos each and Lalo and Junjan 1. Elgar's popular concerto, while written in the early 20th century, belongs to the late Romantic period stylistically. Beethoven contributed to the repertoire with a triple concerto for piano, violin, cello and orchestra while later in the century, Brahms wrote a double concerto for violin, cello and orchestra. Tchaikovsky Euro unregistered trademark S contribution to the genre is a series of variations on a Rococo theme. He also left very fragmentary sketches of a projected cello concerto. Cellist Yuri Leonovich and Tchaikovsky researcher Brett Langston published their completion of the piece in 2006. Karl Reineck, David Popper and Julius Klengel also wrote cello concertos that were popular in their time and are still played occasionally nowadays. Today's core repertoire which is performed the most of any cello concertos are by Elgar, Vo unregistered trademark AK, Saint-Saëns, Haydn, Shostakovich and Schumann, but there are many more concertos which are performed nearly as often. Piano concertos equals. Beethoven Euro unregistered trademark S5 piano concertos increased the technical demands made on the soloist. The last two are particularly remarkable, integrating the concerto into a large symphonic structure with movements that frequently run into one another. His Piano Concerto No. 4 starts, against tradition, with a statement by the piano, after which the orchestra enters in a foreign key, to present what would normally have been the opening duty. The work has an essentially lyrical character. The slow movement is a dramatic dialogue between the soloist and the orchestra. His Piano Concerto No. 5 has the basic rhythm of a Viennese military march. There is no lyrical second subject, but in its place a continuous development of the opening material. He also wrote a triple concerto for piano, violin, cello, and orchestra. The piano concertos of Cramer, Field, Da 1/4 Sec, Woelfl, and Hummel provide a link from the classical concerto to the romantic concerto. Chopin wrote two piano concertos in which the orchestra is very much relegated to an accompanying role. Schumann, despite being a pianist-composer, wrote a piano concerto in which virtuosity is never allowed to eclipse the essential lyrical quality of the work. The gentle, expressive melody heard at the beginning on woodwind and horns bears the material for most of the argument in the first movement. In fact, argument in the traditional developmental sense is replaced by a kind of variation technique in which soloist and orchestra interweave their ideas. Liszt's mastery of piano technique matched that of Paganini for the violin. His concertos No. 1 and No. 2 left a deep impression on the style of piano concerto writing, influencing Rubinstein, and especially Tchaikovsky, whose first piano concerto's rich chordal opening is justly famous. Grieg Euro unregistered trademark S concerto likewise begins in a striking manner after which it continues in a lyrical vein. Brahms's first piano concerto in D minor was the result of an immense amount of work on a mass of material originally intended for a symphony. His second piano concerto in Bar unregistered trademark major has 4 movements and is written on a larger scale than any earlier concerto. Like his violin concerto, it is symphonic in proportions. Fewer piano concertos were written in the late Romantic period. But Sergei Rachmaninoff wrote 4 piano concertos between 1891 and 1926. His second and third, being the most popular of the 4, went on to become among the most famous in piano repertoire. Other Romantic piano concertos, like those by Kalkbrenner, Henri Hertz, Moscheles and Thalberg were also very popular in the Romantic era, but not today. Small-scale works besides the usual 3-movement works with the title concerto, many 19th-century composers wrote shorter pieces for solo instrument and orchestra, often bearing descriptive titles. From around 1800 such pieces were often called Concerts to 1/4 CK or Fantaisie by German composers. Liszt wrote the Totentens for piano and orchestra, a paraphrase of the Dies Irae. Max Bruch wrote a popular Scottish fantasy for violin and orchestra, copyright Czar Frank wrote Les Gens and Variations Symphoniques, and Gabriel Fauré copyright wrote a ballade for piano and orchestra. Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini is widely considered to be structured similarly to a piano concerto. Tchaikovsky's Variations on a Rococo theme for cello and orchestra have an important place in the instrument's repertoire. 20th century, many of the concertos written in the early 20th century belong more to the late Romantic school than to any modernistic movement. Masterpieces were written by Edward Elgar, Sergei Rachmaninoff and Nikolai Mudner, Jean Sibelius, Frederick Delius, Karol Szymanowski, and Richard Strauss. However, in the first decades of the 20th century, several composers such as Debussy, Schoenberg, Berg, Hindemith, Stravinsky, Prokofiev and Bartók started experimenting with ideas that were to have far-reaching consequences for the way music is written and, in some cases, performed. Some of these innovations include a more frequent use of modality, the exploration of non-Western scales, the development of atonality, the wider acceptance of dissonances, the invention of the 12-tone technique of composition and the use of polyrhythms and complex time signatures. These changes also affected the concerto as a musical form. Beside more or less radical effects on musical language, they led to a redefinition of the concept of virtuosity in order to include new and extended instrumental techniques as well as a focus on aspects of sound that had been neglected or even ignored before, such as pitch, timbre and dynamics. In some cases, they also brought about a new approach to the role of the soloist and its relation to the orchestra. Violin concertos. Two great innovators of early 20th century music, Schoenberg and Stravinsky, both wrote violin concertos. The material in Schoenberg unregistered trademark S concerto, like that in Berger unregistered trademark S, is linked by the 12-tone serial method. Bartók K, another major 20th century composer, wrote two important concertos for violin. Russian composers Prokofiev and Shostakovich both wrote two concertos, while Khachaturian wrote a concerto and a concerto rhapsody for the instrument. Hindemith unregistered trademark S concertos hark back to the forms of the 19th century, even if the harmonic language which he used was different. Three violin concertos from David Diamond show the form and neoclassical style. More recently, Dutilleux's Les Brais des Songs has proved an important addition to the repertoire and a fine example of the composer's atonal yet melodic style. Other composers of major violin concertos include Jean Sibelius, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Samuel Barber, Walton, Benjamin Britten, Frank Martin, Carl Nielsen, Paul Hindemith, Alfred Schnittke, György Ligeti, Philip Glass, Dmitri Shostakovich, Sergei Prokofiev, Aram Khachaturian, Béla Bartók and John Adams. Cello concertos. In the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, the cello enjoyed an unprecedented popularity. As a result, its concertante repertoire caught up with those of the piano and the violin both in terms of quantity and quality. An important factor in this phenomenon was the rise of virtuoso cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. His outstanding technique and passionate playing prompted dozens of composers to write pieces for him, first in his native Soviet Union and then abroad. His creations include such masterpieces as Sergei Prokofiev's Symphony Concerto, Dmitri Shostakovich's two cello concertos, Benjamin Britten's Cello Symphony, Henri Dutilleux out un monde lointain. Witold Lutosarowski's Cello Concerto, Dmitri Kubaylovsky's two cello concertos, Aram Khachaturian's Concerto Rhapsody, Arvo Parkuranciarty's Pro et Contra, Alfred Schnittke, Andra Copyright Jelivet and Krzysztof Penderecki second cello concertos, Sofia Gubaidulina's Canticles of the Sun, Luciano Berio's Ritorno d'Eglise Nuovadina, Leonard Bernstein's Three Meditations, James Macmillan's Cello Concerto and Olivier Messiaen's Concert à Quatre. In addition, several important composers who were not directly influenced by Rostropovich wrote cello concertos: György Ligeti, Alexander Glazunov, Paul Hindemith, Toru Dikemtsu, Darius Milhaud, Arthur Honegger, Nikolai Myaskovsky, Samuel Barber, Joaquin Rodrigo, Elliot Carter, Eric Wolfgang Korngold, William Walton, Heitor Villa-Lobos, Hans Werner Henze, Banda Louis Zimmermann and Ana Johanny Rauteva for instance. Piano concertos. Igor Stravinsky wrote three works for solo piano and orchestra: Concerto for piano and wind instruments, Capriccio for piano and orchestra, and Movements for piano and orchestra. Sergei Prokofiev, another Russian composer, wrote no less than 5 piano concertos which he himself performed. Dmitri Shostakovich composed 2. Fellow Soviet composer Aram Khachaturian contributed to the repertoire with a piano concerto and a concerto rhapsody. Arnold Schoenberg unregistered trademark S piano concerto is a well-known example of a dodecaphonic piano concerto. Bar copyright La Bartók K also wrote 3 piano concertos. Like their violin counterparts, they show the various stages in his musical development. Bartók also rearranged his chamber piece, Sonata for 2 pianos and percussion, into a concerto for 2 pianos and percussion, adding orchestral accompaniment. Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote a concerto for piano, while Benjamin Britten's Concerto for Piano is a prominent work from his early period. György Ligeti's concerto has a synthetic quality, it mixes complex rhythms, the composer's Hungarian roots and his experiments with micropolyphony from the 1960s and 70s. Witold Lutosławski's Piano Concerto, completed in the same year, alternates between playfulness and mystery. It also displays a partial return to melody after the composer's aleatoric period. Russian composer Rodion Shchedrin has written 6 piano concertos. Finnish composer Aino Juhani Rautavaara wrote 3 piano concertos, the third one dedicated to Vladimir Ashkenazy, who played and conducted the world premiere. Concertos for other instruments. The 20th century also witnessed a growth of the concertanti repertoire of instruments, some of which had seldom or never been used in this capacity. As a result, almost all classical instruments now have a concertanti repertoire. Examples include alto saxophone concerto, Adams, Creston, Dahl, Denisov, Dubois, Glazunov, Husa, Ibert, Koch, Larsen, Mazelenka, Muchansky, Sorlinen, Tishali, Tomasi, Worley, Yoshimatsu, Bandoneer Cube Den Concerto, Piazzolla, Baritone Saxophone Concerto, Gaines, Glaser, Haas, Van Beerden, Bass Clarinet Concerto, Bouliane, Bass Oboe Concerto, Bayaz, Bassoon Concerto, Ehu, Butterworth, Davis, Donatoni, Eckhart Grammatica Copyright, Fujikura, Gubaidulina, Ha Copyright Jalivit, Kaipanin, Nipper, Landowski, Panufnik, Ryam, Rota, Zavarud, J. Williams, Clarinet Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Copland, Davis, Denisov, Dusapin, Firos, Finzi, Frena Section X, Hartk, Ha Copyright Hindemith, Kanno, Nielsen, Penderecki, Rautavaara, Stravinsky, Takemtsu, Tishali, Tomasi, J. Williams, Clavinet Concerto, Wolf. Contrabassoon Concerto, Ehu, Ebb, Contrabass Flute Concerto, McGowan, Cornet Concerto, Wright, Double Bass Concerto, Ehu, Garni, Hens, Kawaszewski, Davis, Ozawa, Rautavaara, Tuban, Euphonium Concerto, Clark, Kuzma, Bewazen, Gillingham, Golland, Graham, Horowitz, Lindberg, Linkola, Spark, Wilby. Flute Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Davis, Denisov, Dusapin, Harman, Ha Copyright Ibert, Jalivit, Landowski, Nielsen, Penderecki, Rautavaara, Rodrigo, Takemtsu, J. Williams, Free Bass Accordion Concerto, Seri, Senior Guitar Concerto, Arnold, Brewer, Castelnuovo Tedesco, Hovhannes, Oana, Ponce, Rodrigo, Villa-Lobos, Harmonica Concerto, Arnold, Vaughan Williams, Villa-Lobos, Harp Concerto, Ginnistra, Gliari, Junjan, Mio, Jalivit, Rautavaara, Rodrigo, Villa-Lobos, Harpsichord Concerto, Tafalla, Glass, Garcubrecki, Martina, Poulenc, Horn Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Arata Union, Atterberg, Bowen, Carter, Davis, Gliari, Gibbs, Hindemith, Hovhannes, Jacob, Nussen, Ligeti, Muriel, Penderecki, Strauss, Tomasi, J. Williams, Kanon Concerto, Alma, Mandolin Concerto, File, Marimba Concerto, Creston. Larsen, Mio, Rosoro, Svoboda, via +or-0, Oboe Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Bouliane, Davis, Denisov, Harman, Macmillan, Moderna, Martina, Penderecki, Shchedrin, Strauss, Vaughan Williams, Zimmerman, Organ Concerto, Arnold, Hansen, Harrison, Ha Copyright Hindemith, Junjan, Kanno, Macmillan, Peters, Poulenc, Roram, Sowerby, Percussion Concerto, Ehu, Dorman, Glass, Jalivit, Macmillan, Mio, Rautavaara, Sussman, Piccolo Concerto, Davis, Lieberman, Shakuhachi Concerto, Takemtsu, Shen Concerto, Kanno, Unsuk Chin. Soprano Saxophone Concerto, Higdon, Hovhannes, Maki, Torque, Yoshimatsu. Tenor Saxophone Concerto, Bennett, Bewazen, Gould, Niccolo, Ward, Wilder. Timpani Concerto, Drashetsky, Glass, Kraft, Rosoro, Trombone Concerto, Ehu, Bourgeois, Dusapin, Garni, Grandal, Hombo, Larsen, Mio, Olsen, Rota, Rouse, Sandstra paragraph M, Tomasi, Trumpet Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Arata Union, Bar paragraph Hum, Jolivet, Perry, Sandstra paragraph M, Tischeli, Williams, Zimmerman, Tuba Concerto, Ehu, Arata Union, Garni, Hombo, Vaughan Williams, J. Williams, Viola Concerto, Ehu, Arnold, Barta Cubed K, Denisov, Garni, Gubaidulina, Hindemith, Canno, Cancelli, Martina, Mio, Muriel, Penderecki, Schnittke, Takemtsu, Walton. Among the works of the prolific composer Alan Hovhaness may be noted Prayer of St. Gregory for trumpet and strings. Today the concerto tradition has been continued by composers such as Maxwell Davis, whose series of Strathclyde concertos exploit some of the instruments less familiar as soloists. Concertos for orchestra or concert band. In the 20th and 21st centuries, several composers wrote concertos for orchestra or concert band. In these works, different sections and/or instruments of the orchestra or concert band are treated at one point or another as soloists, with emphasis on solo sections and/or instruments changing during the piece. Some examples include those written by Orchestra, Barta Cubed K, Concerto for Orchestra, 1945, Carter, 1969, Hindemith, Op. 38, 1925, Nussen, 1969, Kodaly, 1940, Lindberg, 2003, Lutoslawski, Concerto for Orchestra, 1954, Shchedrin, No. 1 Naughty Limericks, No. 2 The Chimes, No. 3 Old Russian Circus Music, No. 4 Round Dances, No. 5 Four Russian Songs. Dutiller has also described his Ma copyright to Bowles as a concerto for orchestra, while Britten's well-known pedagogical work The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra is essentially a concerto for orchestra in all but name. Concert Band, Bryant, 2007-2010, Voss, 2002, Husser, 1982, Jacob, 1974, Jagger, 1982. Concertos for two or more instruments. Many composers also wrote concertos for two or more soloists. In the Baroque era, Vivaldi's concerti for two, three or four violins, for two cellos, for two mandolins, for two trumpets, for two flutes, for oboe and bassoon, for cello and bassoon, etc. Some of Vivaldi's concerti were written for a very large number of soloists, including the extraordinary RV 555, which features three violins, an oboe, two recorders, two violingles, a chalumeau, two cellos, two harpsichords and two trumpets. Bach's concerti for two violins, for two, three, or four harpsichords, as well as several of his Brandenburg concertos. In the classical era, Haydn's concerto for violin and keyboard and Sinfonia Concertante for violin, cello, oboe and bassoon. Mozart's concerti for two pianos and three pianos, the Sinfonia Concertante for violin and viola, and his concerto for flute and harp. Salieri's triple concerto for oboe, violin and cello, and his double concerto for flute and oboe. In the Romantic era, Beethoven's triple concerto for piano, violin, and cello. Brahms's double concerto for violin and cello. Bruch's double concerto for viola and clarinet, and one for two pianos. In the 20th century, Malcolm Arnold's concerto for piano duet and strings, as well as his concerto for two violins and string orchestra, bar copyright La Barta Cubed K's concerto for two pianos and percussion, Samuel Barber's Capricorn concerto for flute, oboe and trumpet. Benjamin Britten's double concerto for violin and viola. Elliott Carter's double concerto for piano and harpsichord. Peter Maxwell Davis's Strathclyde Concerto No. 3 for horn, trumpet and orchestra, No. 4 for violin, viola and string orchestra, and No. 9 for piccolo, alto flute, cor anglais, E-flat clarinet, bass clarinet, contrabassoon and string orchestra. Frederick Delius's double concerto for violin and cello. Nicholas Flageolow's Concerto Sinfonico for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Jean Frone's Section X's concerto for two pianos and another for two harps, as well as his divertissement for string trio and orchestra, his quadruple concerto for flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon and orchestra, his double concerto for flute and clarinet, and his concerto for 15 soloists and orchestra, Philip Glass's concerto for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Christa cubed Ballhafter's Concerto a Quattro for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Hans Werner Henz's double concerto for oboe and harp. Paul Hindemith's concerto for flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, harp, and orchestra, as well as his concerto for trumpet, bassoon, and strings. Gustav Holst's fugal concerto for flute, oboe and string orchestra. Tristan Keary's concerto for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Gyar Paragraph R.G. Kurtagy's double concerto for piano and cello. Lowell Lieberman's concerto for flute and harp, Gyar Paragraph R.G. Ligeti's double concerto for flute and oboe. John Lord's concerto for group and orchestra for rock band. Witold Lutosławski's concerto for oboe and harp. Mikla cubed S. Maroz's concerto grosso for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Bohuslav Martiniu's concerto for string quartet, concertino for piano trio and string orchestra, 2 concertanti duos for 2 violins, concerto for 2 pianos, Sinfonia Concertanti No. 2 for violin, cello, oboe, bassoon and orchestra with piano, and his concerto for violin and piano. Olivier Messiaen's Concert a Quarter for piano, cello, oboe and flute. Darius Milhaud's Symphony Concertanti for bassoon, horn, trumpet and double bass, as well as his concerti for flute and violin, and for marimba and vibraphone. Michael Nymann's concerto for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Francis Pouling's concerto for 2 pianos. Ottorino Respighi's concerto a cinque for piano, oboe, violin, trumpet, double bass and string orchestra. Joaquin N. Rodrigo's Concerto Madrigal for 2 guitars and Concerto Andaluz for 4 guitars. William Russo's Concerto for Blues Band. Alfred Schnittke's double concerto for oboe, harp, and strings, as well as his Konzert zu dritt, for violin, viola, violoncello and strings. Rodion Shchedrin's double concerto for piano and cello. Michael Tippett's triple concerto for violin, viola, and cello. Charles Wuorinen's concerto for saxophone quartet and orchestra. In the 21st century, William Bolcom's Concerto Grosso for saxophone quartet and orchestra. Leo Broer's Guitar Concerto No. 10 Book of Signs, for 2 guitars. Muhammad Firaz's double concerto States of Fantasy for violin and cello. Philip Glass's Concerto Fantasy for 2 timpanists and orchestra, a double concerto for violin and cello. William P. Perry's Gemini Concerto for violin and piano. Carl Jenkins' Over the Stone for 2 harps, Terry Manning's The Darkness Within Light Concerto for flute and piano. See also. References. Chisholm, Hugh, ed. Concerto. Encyclopædia Britannica. Cambridge University Press. External links.